We'll move on to our last speaker now, and both Professor Whiten and Professor Bell mentioned a bit about how society can and could shape research, but now we go to the other end of the spectrum where how research can shape public policy.
The bad news is I don't have any pictures for you, so you're going to have to look at me. That's your terrible fate. I am going to talk about the relationship between our research and public policy, but I want to start off in a sense of picking up some of the things others have said about some of the dichotomies we draw, some of the distinctions we draw, and the way in which I think they get in the way both of good research and of making our research matter. Verity talked about this distinction between pure research and applied research, grubby research, and there clearly is a hierarchy. Often it's thought that pure is good, applied is inferior. I think there are a couple of other distinctions that we need to address and we need to challenge. Andy's just pointed to one, which I think is very important. This sense of the distinction between our academic publications in the high status journals and our other outputs, which might be talks to schools, might be something in the media. And again, there's this incredible snobbery which says, I have a paper in Nature, I count. I have written something for school students. That's really rather inferior. It's dumbing down. In many ways, I actually think the opposite is sometimes true. It's much easier to get something into an academic journal, which is rather specialized, rather narrow, rather specific, to have something which is a big enough story and which is conceptually clear enough to interest the general public, to interest school students, often imposes an intellectual discipline which is far harder. A number of years ago, we did a study which replicated one of the most famous studies in psychology, Zimbardo's Stanford Prison Study. And we published it. We've published now about 10 articles in academic journals about it. But it took us many more years to refine the story and clarify the story sufficiently that we can then go and talk to school student audiences. So for me, quite often, talking to what we think of as lower level, and that in itself is a pernicious term, audiences, demands a far greater intellectual accomplishment and intellectual rigor, I think, than to get into the high impact journals. So again, I think we need to think how we value different forms of input. What is really important in terms of the work we do. Let me take yet another distinction. It's one of the most fundamental distinctions that we come across. It structures this university, even physically. It's the distinction between science and arts. Very famously, the novelist C.P. Snow talked about two cultures in our society, the scientific culture and the arts culture. And we, scientists, we like to use the word scientists, think ourselves as very different from the arts. But if we go back to what Keith was saying, and we think about what's valuable about our research, part of what is valuable about it is, in a sense, the sheer beauty of good research. We talk about the elegance of an excellent experiment. When we come across certain processes, I remember in my first year looking at the Krebs cycle, the way in which energy is created and exchanged within the body. There is an architecture to that, which is the equivalent of any great cathedral. There is a beauty to that appreciating it has a value independent of all the outcomes it has. And it seems to me often we think the base is economic, but human beings do not live by bread alone. What makes us human, what makes us full of awe, what gives us the emotions and the feelings and the positive aspects of being human is often those aspects of beauty, of awe. And to me they are there as much in science as in the arts. And if we don't value that, actually we often undermine the value of pure scientific research. So again, it seems to me, there is a beauty to the best work we do, which is equivalent to a great painting, as I say, a great cathedral, or whatever. The architecture of our cognition is an amazing thing. The architecture of our chemistry, of our neural structures equally. So again, I think this dichotomy is often pernicious. It gets in the way of understanding the value of what we're doing and also of being valued. I think we should be more upfront and we should talk more about the aesthetic qualities of science. But of course, In many ways, we do what we do, not just because of its inherent aesthetic quality, but because in some way or another, it matters, and it matters in the world. If you want to take most of, certainly European social thought for the last 60 years, certainly social psychology, it arises from the Holocaust. It arises from the question that has haunted us ever since, and haunts us every time we hear of Rwanda, Darfur, Croatia, many other examples, many going on at the moment, of how can it be that human beings can harm other human beings, not for anything they've done, simply because of who they are? How can we understand these aspects of human behavior? How can we understand how groups behave towards each other? And the reason why we study it there is not an aesthetic question. We're dealing with great ugliness, not with great beauty. It's how can we do something about it? How can we have an impact? How can we change the world? There's that old Marx quote you will all know, that the point is not just to interpret the world, it is to change it. And that lies at the root of what much of us are doing. We are concerned with the way our world is organized, and whether we can have an impact upon that at various levels. We are interested in public and in social policy. And in recent years, I have found myself in a number of ways involved in aspects of public policy. Some of the work that we have done has had an impact on the management and the policing of collective behaviour. Some of the work that we have done has had to do with planning for what happens when there are emergencies and how people behave in emergencies. I've worked with the Equalities and Human Rights Commission to look at the question of good relations between different groups in society, a number of forms of work. And out of that, a number of questions and a number of dilemmas arise. So I want to make a number of points, but I also want to point to some of the tricky aspects of engaging with the world. It's a little bit like politics. People say of politics, if you want to stay pure, then be ineffective. Then you won't ever have to make tough decisions. And there are compromises, and there are difficulties, and one can't avoid them, and I think we need to address them, and I hope we will address them in the second half of this meeting. The first point I want to make, though, and again it echoes what nearly every speaker has said, is I did not start off thinking about engagement. My interest in collective behaviour was purely theoretical. I wanted to challenge the notion that people are less rational, are more emotional in groups. I wanted to understand the fundamental transformations that happen in our behaviour when we come together in groups and in large groups. And one of the points I wanted to make was that things like violence are not inherent in group behaviour. They arise out of particular understandings of the group and particular dynamics between groups. Now, one of the implications of that is that if violence arises out of dynamics between groups, then in order to study the violence, you can't just look at the crowd, the mass, you have to look at the other, who is often the police or the army or the authorities. You need to look at the ways in which the behaviour of the one affects the other, such that the police aren't just there to contain the inherent violence of the crowd. What the police do may actually create or escalate violence. And it's through that that we began to look at forms of police action which escalate conflict, and began to think of ways in which they could change the way they behave in order to de-escalate conflict. So again, starting from a rather pure theoretical notion, we came to some very practical research. The work on emergencies, on panic. Again, the theoretical question for me was that panic is one of the ways, another one of the ways in which we discredit collective behaviour. You've all seen the Hollywood movies where if it's a disaster movie, you will always get people running out of burning buildings or sinking ships or whatever it might be, screaming, waving their hands and behaving irrationally. And again, we wanted to argue, no, that's not what happens. And indeed, the collective psychology is often the solution, not the problem. And if you look at real disasters, like the London bombings, what you find are accounts which say that people actually started helping each other. They were the first responders, and often the emergency services could get in the way by disrupting the way in which people help each other. That resilience lies in the group, it's not something imposed upon the emotional group from the outside. That changes our understanding of resilience. changes our notion of how the emergency services should respond, has actually rather profound implications for public policy. So again, starting from something theoretical, you come to something eminently practical. And it has even led to us sitting in the cabinet rooms telling conservative ministers that the problem lies in public policy, in private property, which divides people, and we've got to think how to socialise property in emergencies. One of the most entertaining moments in my life, but I will say no more on that. But let me come to the dilemmas. Because one of the dilemmas one always has is who to engage with. How does this engagement happen? If you do nothing and you wait for people to come to you, who will come to you? They will be the powerful. They will be those who have got the facility of looking at academic research, of checking it out, of coming to you. They will be those with resources. So when I started doing crowd research, the first contact I had was with what was then called the SPG. These were the police riot squads, who were renowned actually for their repressive behaviour. Did I want to have links with them, or did I want to have links with the organisations which perhaps were organising collective behaviour? And now I do work with the police. On the one hand, I do believe in trying to make collective action more conflictual so that people can participate. To me, there is an education to being involved in collective behaviour, and if people think it's going to be violent, then it becomes narrowed down. On the whole, it becomes young, fit, active, predominantly men, street-fighting men go into collective events. And I want there to be a democracy of the street. So I think it is important to engage with the police, but sometimes I wonder, am I actually sometimes facilitating more repressive action? And it's a dilemma, it's a problem. I'll give you another example. Recently, I've done quite a lot of work on leadership. Now, if you want to characterise leadership research, I hope nobody from management is here. To put it very simply, hello, and very crudely, certainly in psychology, most work on management is how to get the workers to work harder for no more money. That's what it's about, okay? Actually, in many ways, what interests me is how do you get the workers to get together and have the power to challenge situations where they're being exploited by bad management. That's what interests me. Now, if I sit around and do nothing, I get contacted by the powerful. I do get contacted by management. How do I act in order to have a relationship with community organisations, with trade unions, with NGOs and so on? The question of who you have engagement with, I think, is a major problem and a major issue, and one certainly in terms of public policy that we need to think about very carefully indeed. It's not something which has a very simple solution. Now, I'm looking at the time and we're nearly finished, but I want to make one further point. If you look at most of the major challenges that affect us, the interesting thing is they are primarily psychological. Let me take three, probably the three major challenges we face in the world today. Let's look at health. Now, certainly drugs are important. I don't deny that drugs are important. Antibiotics are a very good example of drugs that are very important, and there's a lot of publicity nowadays about the problems of antibiotics being overused and therefore becoming less effective, so that in the future when we go into hospital for a very basic problem, we could find ourselves getting infections and all dying as a result. But aside from antibiotics, it's hard to think of drugs which have fundamentally transformed health. The things that have transformed health are, number one, public policy. The sewerage system affected health in the 19th century more than anything else. And the other things that affect health are things like diet, smoking, alcohol usage. They are all to do with behaviour. And if you want to change health, you can probably affect far more of the variance psychologically by changing behaviour than you can medically. And yet, most of the investment is at the medical rather than the psychological level. We have not got through that message, that actually the psychological and changing behaviour is of fundamental importance. Let's look at environmental change, global warming. Again, you can get more efficient technologies. You can change your bulbs and make them more effective. You can get cars that use less fuel, but again, changing behaviour in many ways is far more fundamental than that. It's far better to get people to turn off the lights when they don't need them, not to use their cars when they don't need them, not to use appliances when they don't need them, and so on. Again, changing behaviour and understanding how to change behaviour probably explains far more of the variance than the technological, but still the investment in the technology is far, far greater than anything else. Okay. And there are more examples, and I could go into more examples, but one of the issues is that it seems to me actually we could have far more impact on public policy than we actually do. But very often psychology is excluded when it comes to the public level. And I remember having a discussion with Claudia Hammond, who some of you might know of. She presents All in the Mind, BBC Radio 4 psychology programme. And she was bemoaning the fact that on the whole, when you talk to other broadcasters, and when you talk to government, they think of psychology at an individual level. How do we change the individual? But when it comes to public phenomena, they don't think about psychology at all. If you look at the debate on immigration, okay, one of the biggest political debates in our country, one of the things you're concerned about more than anything else, all the time you will get comments from sociologists, from political scientists, from anthropologists, from economists, but psychologists? That's our bread and butter. Understanding the impact of the presence of others on how we behave, understanding intergroup relations. It's work that Nicole does, work that I do. It's work that so many social psychologists do, and yet we're excluded. So one of the questions that we face is, I think, we have the potential for massive impact. Massive impact in these areas, as I say, of health, of environmental behaviour, of social problems like, like conflict between groups, and yet we are ignored. Time and time again we're ignored in policy. And I think we've got to ask why, understand why, look at the representation of our discipline and see how we can change it so that we can have the impact on public policy which would allow us to say not only do we study things like the phenomena which lead to disease, penury and hatred, but actually we are part of the solution. So that's all I have to say.